Imagine you are standing at the edge of a frozen, wind-whipped ridge right at dawn. There is a sheer drop on either side of you.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and if you slip, the only thing stopping you from a catastrophic fall is this single green rope. It's physically tying you to the colleague standing a few feet behind you and the one a few feet ahead.
That is a terrifying image to start with.
Right. But today, we are taking those intense, literal life-or-death stakes of high-altitude mountaineering and using them to dissect one of the most stressful, isolating leadership dynamics in the modern workplace. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
I am so excited to get into this document today. It's titled, What a DSL Can Learn From a Mountaineer.
And we should probably clarify that acronym right away.
Yes, definitely. So we are specifically applying this lens to the role of a designated safeguarding lead, or DSL.
Right.
For anyone unfamiliar with the term, if you operate within a school, sports academy, a hospital, or any organization responsible for vulnerable people, the DSL is the individual holding the ultimate, inescapable responsibility for child protection and safety.
They are the ones receiving the midnight crisis calls.
Exactly. They hold the most volatile, legally sensitive, and frankly emotionally devastating information an organization possesses.
But, I mean, even if you have never heard the acronym DSL, and the closest you've ever come to scaling a mountain is, like, looking at the logo on your winter jacket, the underlying mechanics of this framework absolutely apply to you.
Oh, 100%.
Think about that very specific, sickening dread of being the sole decision maker on a massive project at work.
We've all been there.
Right. You send an email making a high-stakes call, and as you wait for the reply, the realization sets in that the entire risk of failure sits squarely on your shoulders.
That is such a heavy feeling.
It is. The traditional workplace culture tells us that being a leader means suffering on that island alone. But the document we are exploring today fundamentally dismantles that myth of the solo hero. Okay, let's unpack this. The core thesis here is that on a mountain, individual strength is not enough. No one climbs alone.
And that is such a huge shift, because the isolation you are describing is practically baked into the job description of a traditional leader, and especially a DSL.
Right, because they are the top of the chain.
Exactly. The expectation is that you are the final point of escalation. When a classroom teacher observes a troubling bruise on a student or a sudden behavioral shift, they pass that observation up the chain to the DSL.
And suddenly, the DSL is standing there alone, holding a highly delicate piece of a puzzle.
Yes. But the mountaineering framework from our source material demands a complete paradigm shift. It says individual strength is irrelevant when the terrain is this dangerous. As you said, no one climbs a mountain alone.
Which brings us back to that visceral image of the climbers on the ridge, connected by the rope.
The rope team. That's core insight number 1 from the document. Safeguarding is a rope team.
Meaning, if one person hesitates, the others feel the tension and pause.
Exactly. And if one person slips, the entire collective system arrests the fall. Progress is entirely collective.
Okay, but let me push back on this a little bit.
Go for it.
Because in a corporate or educational hierarchy, titles matter, right? If my title is Designated Safeguarding Lead, the buck stops with me.
Legally, yes.
So if we tell an entire staff of 200 people that they are all holding the rope and all collectively responsible, human psychology dictates that no one will actually take action.
Ah, the bystander effect.
Exactly. It's the classic bystander effect. Everyone assumes the person next to them has it handled. Doesn't that mean if everyone is responsible, no one is?
That is a really valid point, and it's the exact trap organizations fall into when they misunderstand shared responsibility. The reframing here from the source is critical. The DSL is not the sole protector of the organization.
Okay.
The DSL is the connector of the safeguarding rope team.
The connector.
Right. Think about it. The rope itself doesn't possess the physical strength to drag a climber up a cliff face.
Yeah, that'd be impossible.
The rope simply connects the kinetic energy, the stability, and the momentum of the entire team.
The connector rather than the sole protector.
I like that. I'm thinking about how that actually functions mechanically in a school environment, for example.
Walk me through it.
Well, the rope is made up of, like, the homeroom teachers, the administrative staff, the school nurses, the guidance counselors.
Okay.
If the DSL tries to strap all those people to their back and muscle their way up the mountain alone, they just collapse under the weight.
They burn out completely.
Right. So the DSL's actual job is to ensure the tension on the rope is maintained between all those disparate departments.
Yeah, keeping the connection tight.
They ensure that the nurse communicates with the homeroom teacher, and the teacher communicates with the counselor, so that information flows seamlessly across the team.
That is a perfect translation of the concept. But we also have to consider the massive logistical vulnerability of being tied together.
What do you mean?
Well, on a physical mountain, if 5 climbers are roped together and the leader makes a catastrophic misstep and falls, gravity doesn't care about their teamwork.
The leader will simply pull the other 4 climbers off the mountain with them. The rope becomes a huge liability if the team doesn't have something securing them to the terrain.
So if everyone is roped together, what prevents the entire team from pulling each other off the mountain if one person makes a catastrophic slip?
That brings us to core insight number 2 from the document: anchors.
Anchors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's look at what physically stops the fall. Because if a well-meaning teacher makes a terrible judgment call regarding a student's safety, and they are metaphorically tied to the DSL and the rest of the leadership team,
Which they are.
right, then that single error can drag the entire organization into a legal and moral catastrophe. A rope team without a failsafe is just a group of people agreeing to crash together.
That is a bleak but accurate way to put it. In high-altitude climbing, that failsafe is called an anchor. An anchor is a secure point, a piece of hardware driven deep into solid rock or thick ice. It stabilizes the team.
It grounds them.
Exactly. When the terrain gets uncertain or the weather shifts, the anchor prevents a single slip from turning into a fatal plummet.
So how does that translate to the office?
When we translate the physical hardware of a mountain anchor into the operational reality of a school or an office, anchors are the structural, unglamorous realities of your daily operations.
Like what?
They are clear, unambiguous safeguarding policies. They are trusted, easy-to-access reporting systems, strong relationships, consistent routines. The source states a blunt professional truth here. Without strong anchors, safeguarding becomes fragile.
Let's look at the mechanics of why a policy acts as an anchor. It's about reducing cognitive load, right?
Tell me more about that.
Take a simple mandatory morning check-in routine. That routine forces a daily baseline interaction between a teacher and a student.
Right, it's systematized.
Exactly. Because the teacher doesn't have to invent a new way to interact every morning. Their brain is free to notice subtle deviations. They notice a child is unusually withdrawn or, wearing long sleeves on a brutally hot day.
Yes.
The routine is the anchor that catches the subtle warning signs before they become a freefall.
I mean, without those rigid structural anchors, an organization's safeguarding culture relies entirely on individual heroics.
Which is terrifying.
It is. You're basically hoping that a particularly observant teacher happens to be paying attention on the right day.
It makes me think about driving on the highway. Like, when I am going 70 miles an hour, I don't trust my brakes because we had a great team-building seminar.
I would hope not.
I trust my brakes because of their mechanical consistency. Every single time I hit the pedal, the brake pads engage. I don't have to hope the brakes are feeling motivated today.
Right.
And I don't have to wonder if they understand the braking policy. They are an anchor I implicitly trust because the mechanism works every time. In an organization, a reporting system has to function exactly like a brake pedal.
That is a brilliant analogy, and it leads perfectly into core insight number 3. Trust is the system.
Trust is the friction that actually makes the brakes work.
Exactly. In climbing, you must implicitly trust the rope, the anchor driven into the ice, and the person standing behind you, or else movement stops.
Movement just stops.
Yeah, if a climber loses trust in the anchor, their behavior changes instantly. They freeze. They refuse to take the next challenging step because they believe a slip will be fatal. And being frozen on a mountain rapidly increases your exposure to danger.
Wow. We see that paralysis in organizations all the time.
All the time.
If a math teacher observes a concerning interaction in the hallway, but they don't trust the reporting system, maybe they think the online portal is too complicated, or worse, they think leadership will just ignore it. They freeze.
They keep the observation to themselves.
Right. So in safeguarding, staff must trust leadership, and students must trust adults. How do you build that?
The document is very clear on this. The mechanics of building that trust require relentless consistency and transparency. But the most critical element is follow-through on concerns.
Follow through.
Yes. When that math teacher finally takes the risk of logging a concern about a student, they are extending trust. If leadership receives that report, files it away, and never loops back to the teacher.
The rope is cut.
Exactly.
The teacher feels exposed. They took a professional risk to report something, and they were met with silence.
And what happens next time?
Human nature dictates they will rationalize it away. They will tell themselves it's probably nothing, just to avoid the black hole of the reporting process.
And that is how the entire safeguarding system catastrophically fails. Not because of malice, but because of a lack of administrative follow-through.
Okay, so having strong anchors and a deep well of trust is highly effective when you are standing still or when the conditions are clear. But having anchors is great when you're standing still. What happens when the weather suddenly turns?
That is the big question.
The document has this other image. It describes two climbers pausing in a snowy landscape, and one of them is pointing out across the terrain, planning the route.
Right, because they have to constantly adapt. And this dives into core insights 4 and 5 from the document. The terrain changes and risk evolves.
So the reality of any complex environment, whether it's a glacier in the Alps or a massive high school in the middle of a semester, is dynamic.
Extremely dynamic. Therefore, what was a perfectly safe route an hour ago might not be safe now. A safe route can become a death trap when the sun softens the snow.
How does that look in a safeguarding context?
Well, the conditions shift the moment new information emerges. You might have a behavior management plan that is working beautifully for a student in October, but by November, new information comes to light about a crisis in their home life.
The context surrounding the behavior entirely shifts. The static safety plan is suddenly inadequate.
Exactly. And the expert points out a fascinating mountaineering principle here. The summit is optional, safety is not.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
I agree.
Because there is a deeply ingrained psychological hurdle here, especially in corporate leadership and high-achievement cultures. We usually view turning back as quitting or failure.
It's seen as a weakness.
Right. You set a strategic goal, you push through adversity, you overcome obstacles, and you reach the summit. But the document explicitly states that in safeguarding, abandoning a plan that is no longer safe is a proactive exercise of professional judgment.
It is a profound rejection of ego-driven leadership. Turning back on a mountain is not a failure. It is the ultimate preventative measure.
So what does this actually look like in practice?
In child protection, continuing to push forward with a plan without relentlessly reassessing it as new variables emerge actively increases the potential for harm. A safeguarding decision is never a one-time event that you file in a drawer. It is a living, breathing assessment that requires active, ongoing review.
The psychology of this is fascinating. Let's say a leadership team implements an internal counseling program for a troubled student.
Okay.
They've invested time, money, and professional pride into this internal solution. 3 weeks later, the student's risk profile escalates.
Which happens frequently.
Right. A traditional, ego-driven leader will try to force the internal counseling to work because abandoning it feels like admitting a mistake.
They want to reach the summit.
Exactly. But the mountaineer looks at the escalating risk, realizes the weather has turned, and immediately abandons the internal plan.
They pivot. They move from internal support to external referral, escalating earlier than planned. They recognize that stubbornly pushing for the summit when a blizzard is rolling in is how people lose their lives.
So you normalize the act of pivoting.
Yes. In practice, this means deliberately building reassessment checkpoints into every single action plan. You openly commend staff members who raise their hand and say, the plan we agreed on yesterday is no longer safe today.
You regularly revisit cases, you adapt to the shifting terrain, and the organization survives.
Exactly.
I have to say, the mountaineering framework is incredibly elegant for diagnosing organizational behavior.
It really is.
Yet, we have to acknowledge that the power of the analogy, while also introducing the source's honest bit, the critical section where the mountaineering metaphor intentionally breaks down.
Yes, the limits of the analogy. It is vital we address this.
Because they aren't perfectly parallel.
No, the fundamental nature of the two activities diverges sharply when you look at the underlying mandate. Mountaineering, no matter how extreme, is fundamentally a voluntary pursuit.
Right. Nobody is forcing you up the mountain.
Exactly. It is a team-based exploration where climbers are voluntarily managing physical risk for the sake of adventure. If a climber is halfway up a rock face and realizes the objective is simply too dangerous, they can make the call to abandon the climb, pack up their carabiners, descend to base camp, and go to sleep in a warm bed.
The risk vanishes the moment they decide to walk away.
Precisely. Safeguarding, on the other hand, is a duty of care involving multi-agency protection of human well-being.
So what does this all mean? If a climber can just abandon their objective and go home, but a DSL must act because child safety isn't optional, how do they handle that inescapable pressure?
You can't look at a highly volatile multi-agency abuse case and say, the terrain here is getting too complicated, I'm going to pack up my gear and opt out. The problem remains. The child is still at risk.
The pressure is inescapable. You can't relieve it by simply going home. So how does a leader survive that crushing chronic weight without burning out completely?
That brings us to core insight number 6. This is exactly why leadership cannot be solitary, because you can't just walk away. Isolation increases risk, while collaboration reduces it.
So the concept of the rope team is not just a nice team-building metaphor. It is a survival mechanism.
Yes. Operating in a silo increases the risk of a fatal error. Collaboration aggressively reduces it. The DSL must create space for discussion and encourage professional challenge from their team.
Even if the organizational chart designates one person as the lead, the entire culture has to be engineered so that the team supports the cognitive load of those decisions.
Absolutely. When lives are literally on the line, the absolute last thing a leader needs is a room full of people just nodding in agreement.
They need pushback.
A robust rope team culture requires the leader to purposefully invite that pushback. The DSL needs to sit in a briefing and say, this is my assessment of the risk, and this is my proposed route forward. Where are my blind spots? What am I failing to see?
They need colleagues who feel structurally empowered to look at the plan and say, I see the route you're charting, but I am deeply concerned about this unstable snowpack over here.
Exactly.
So to synthesize the takeaways here, this is the rope team culture described in the document's leadership layer. A truly resilient system is one where everyone sees themselves as part of the safety net.
The receptionist who buzzes visitors in feels just as connected to the safety net as the principal or the CEO.
Responsibility is shared, not centralized. It isn't hoarded at the top. It is distributed across the tension of the rope.
The support structures are highly visible, and the anchors are implicitly trusted by every single person in the building.
This forces a rather piercing operational question.
It does, and this is the document's final reflection, which I want to pose directly to the listener right now, challenging you to apply it to your own life and career.
Let's hear it.
Look at the safeguarding system, or really any critical infrastructure within your organization. Does it function because the system itself is structurally sound? Or does it only function because you personally are muscling it forward every single day?
Oh, man. That is the ultimate stress test for any professional carrying a heavy load.
If you close your laptop and go off the grid for a 2-week vacation, does the safety and efficacy of your department begin to crumble? Do the decisions paralyze?
If the answer is yes, you haven't actually built a resilient system. You have simply built a terrifyingly fragile environment where you are the single point of failure.
It requires a level of uncomfortable honesty to assess your own leadership style. Regardless of your industry, whether you are actively managing child protection cases, launching a high-stakes startup, or directing a complex logistics team, evaluate your current load. Where are you carrying responsibility alone when you should be strengthening the rope team around you?
You need to aggressively drive those anchors into the rock.
Yes.
Well, we have established today that navigating high-stakes risk relies entirely on the invisible, mechanical tension of trust and consistent relationships. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on this framework.
I love these.
We know trust is the anchor that saves lives. But what happens to the structural integrity of a rope team when an organization experiences massive, sudden staff turnover?
Oh, that is a nightmare scenario.
Right. When the seasoned climbers, the veteran teachers and administrators who know the terrain, who have memorized the policies, and who inherently trust your leadership retire or resign.
And suddenly you find yourself tied to a group of new hires.
Exactly. They don't know the landscape, they haven't tested the anchors, and crucially, they don't know you. How do you rapidly forge those life-saving mechanics of trust with complete strangers before the organizational weather turns and before the inevitable crisis hits?
That is something every leader needs to think about.
Take a hard look at your anchors. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.